This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to thought, and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dalia Shendlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. If you like us, please join our community of supporters by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find it on our website. Our guest today is Dr. Keith Kahn-Harris. He's a British sociologist and writer, dealing with issues ranging from Jewish communal affairs to the sociology of culture and heavy metal music. He has written several books, including his forthcoming Denial, The Unspeakable Truth, to be published by Notting Hill Editions. The book attempts to analyze the rise of denialism, a principled and ideological propensity to deny the scientific consensus on a broad range of issues, from the historical facticity of the Holocaust to the contribution of mankind to climate change, etc. Keith Kahn-Harris, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, Gilad. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Our pleasure. The obvious question is, the book is about to be published in 2018, and it's probably no coincidence. Is denialism really a recent trend?
It's not, but I think it's got in the news recently for reasons that are not hard to divine, with the rise of Donald Trump in Britain, with Brexit, with concepts such as fake news and post-truth becoming much discussed. There's, I think, a renewed interest in this. Interestingly, I first pitched a book on denial to a publisher in 2007. And although there was some interest, it didn't get picked up. But the same editor who couldn't get it through his publisher over 10 years ago came back to me last year and said, "Are you still interested in writing it?" And I think that says something.
So what you're saying, the book was pertinent 10 years ago, just the same?
Or let me rephrase that. Were there different issues you were focused on 10 years ago than
The
now?
issue of denial would have been just as relevant 10 years ago, 20 years ago, even 30 years ago. But I think certainly in the last 2, 3, 4 years, I think it's taken a new twist. And that means the book I've written now, that's coming out this year, is very different to the book that would have came out in 2007, 2008.
What is that twist?
That twist is that whilst we've become used in recent decades to denialism, to organised quasi-scholarly attempts to create structures to attack established truths, we've become very used to that with the Holocaust denial, with organised attempts by the tobacco industry to prevent knowledge that deny that smoking cured cancer, that smoking caused cancer, and more recently with global warming denial. Whilst that's become a familiar part of the post-war world, what we've seen much more recently is what I call post-denialism, which is going beyond denialism to a world where the relationship between truth, facts, political discourse becomes ever more flexible than it ever was before.
Well, then why don't we try to figure out the distinction here? You're talking about denial, which everybody does in the book. I mean, in the book, you explain that everybody does that, to denialism as a sort of way of life and an ideology. And now you're talking about post-denialism. Can you sort of distinguish what those different things mean?
Yes. Well, as you say in the book, denial is what it is to be human. We cannot continuously, as human beings, face the truth of the world or about ourselves or about what it is to be human on a continuous basis. We have to be selective. It's part of what it is to live. Of course, that doesn't mean it can't become pathological and dangerous, but it is fundamentally something that we do. Denialism is something that builds on that, but it is a much more recent development. It's a modern development. By modern, I mean 200-300 years old, in the sense that it builds on denial as a form of refusing to know by creating an alternate reality. So denial of climate change, for example, is just trying not to think about it, is behaving the way you always have without the awareness constantly going into your mind about what's going on.
So more like repression.
It's related to that. I don't think it's identical, but it's related. Denialism isn't just refusing to look. or refusing to know. It's knowing better. It's knowing differently. It's creating a structure. And quite literally, I mean, it's about creating institutions. It's about journals. It's about all that sort of stuff. And crucially, one of the great mistakes I think people have made in talking about denialism is they see it as an assault on scholarship and science. Actually, it's the opposite. It's a tribute to scholarship and science. It's saying this is the most prestigious language in which you can validate your ideas. So therefore, they create a simulacrum of it, often a very good simulacrum, sometimes not so good. So that's the difference between denial and denialism.
And what's the post part?
The post part, exploring ways of not having to deny anymore. Now, for that, to explain that, I have to go back to why I explained why denialism emerged in the first place. Denialism emerged in the first place because in the modern period, gradually, all sorts of very old, very common human desires became literally impossible to speak of out loud. We can see this with genocide. Genocide is something that human beings have a very long history of doing. And there was a time in human history where if you were a ancient king who committed genocide, you'd put up a monument saying, I wiped out this people.
Look at me, I did this.
Well, we have that in the Bible as well. I mean, it's a normal part of political discourse. And in the modern period, that changed. But what didn't change is the desire to commit genocide in the first place. So you still commit genocide, but you can't publicly talk about it. In fact, you have to deny it. So that's the problem of the modern world. We remain the same humans that we always have been, and we want the same things, more or less. But the way we can talk about our desires has become much more narrow. Now, that's not necessarily always a bad thing, but it can have pathological consequences. So in the case of global warming denialism, there are understandable reasons why people might not want to face this. It's not just about people in the oil industry who want to safeguard their profits. The kind of changes that we would need in order to forestall global warming are difficult to contemplate. It involves a radical change in what it is to be human. So to go against that and to say, you know what, we shouldn't make those changes, but I accept the consequences, right? To say we shouldn't do anything. And yes, if millions in Bangladesh will die or displaced, then that is a price I'm willing to pay. That's the unspeakable bit. You just simply can't say it. There's not a language to say that. Now, going back to denialism and post-denialism, post-denialism is kind of going one step back towards closer to a world where you can speak of those desires. It's tentatively exploring the possibility that maybe we don't need denialism anymore. And often the form post-denialism takes is a kind of laziness. So one example I give, and it's quite an obvious one, but I think it's quite eloquent, is in 2012, Donald Trump tweeted that global warming was a hoax invented by the Chinese. Right? Now, that is not something that most denialists argue, right? But it's a garbled version, maybe, of some denialist claims. And he's never really doubled down on that. He just threw that tweet into the world. And that's what post-denialism is. It's throwing out unformed or half-formed thoughts into the world that signal towards denialism, but as though it's hardly worth bothering anymore, as though you're coming very close to saying, you know what, let Bangladesh drown, right? And Donald Trump is the embodiment of that.
I think that the strength of your book is that you put different phenomena that we are used to treat separately, such as Holocaust denial or climate change denial or anti-vaxxers, etc., into the same sort of intellectual process or perhaps emotional process. But having said that, I wonder why you think that some denialisms stick more than others. I mean, you don't treat the Flat Earth Society or even those who say that smoking doesn't cause cancer. I mean, there were pretty big denialists 50 years ago, but not so much anymore. How do you account for these fluctuations and changes?
Well, it's partly to do with the difference between short-term interests and long-term interests. Ultimately, people in the tobacco industry were trying to prevent erosion of their profits for as long as possible. But it's a war that I'm sure they knew they would never win in the end. So what denialism did is it kept things on the road for a bit longer, right? But I don't think anyone in the tobacco industry, either now or in the 1960s, really thought that this was something that could be prevented forever. Other things, though, there isn't really an end point. So Holocaust denialism is an example of that. If you want to validate the example of the Nazis, if you want to validate the slaughter of Jews, the possibilities of doing that openly are still fairly minimal. So you're still forced to resort to Holocaust denialism. The only way we could see an end to Holocaust denial, and to other genocide denials as well, is a world in which it would be okay to openly advocate for genocide. Now, there are some signs that that's starting to emerge, but we're still a very long way from that. So it's a long-term thing that is still necessary.
You mean the only two options for these denialists, specifically the Holocaust denialists, are either to be in this denialist frame of mind or to openly advocate it? They can't ever be, I mean, you do discuss this in your book. What are the possibilities? The third possibility that they may simply one day say, we were wrong. There was a Holocaust.
Yes, that is an option. And one of the interesting things is in recent years, you have seen some Holocaust deniers recant. But it's important to recognize what they've recanted on and what they haven't recanted on. They haven't recanted from anti-Semitism. What they've done is to say, this is just too difficult. We really cannot keep this show on the road. It's just too hard. And we're not convincing anybody other than a relatively select few. So they're trying to find ways of expression of anti-Semitism in new ways, right? And one of the things that they're exploring is kind of militant apathy, saying, you know what, the Jews were killed, but I don't actually care, right? And that's not quite advocation of genocide, but it's a step towards it, and it could lead to it in the long term. And you see that also with global warming denialism as well. Some global warming denialists have explored saying, it's happening, but I don't really care. It's not going to be too bad, and so on. So yes, there are other options. It's not quite as stark a choice that I said, but I would say that exploring those sort of middle ground options could eventually pave the way for full acknowledgement.
I want to understand why you think in the 10 intervening years when you first had this idea to now there's been sort of this upsurge in awareness and possibly prominence of denialism and fake news and all this stuff. Where do you think it comes from? What happened over the last 10 years to, urge this on?
Well, it's really glib to put it all down to the internet. And of course, the internet...
But you're going to do it, aren't you?
No, I'm not going to do it completely. And of course, the internet did exist in 2007. But I think...
And had for about 15 years.
It had.
No, but social media didn't.
That's the point, is social media. I'm not going to be so crass as to say it's just Facebook's fault and Twitter's fault.
Pile on to Zuckerberg, poor guy.
But it's got a lot to do with it. There's no question that it's got a lot to do with it, because it allows information that was once marginal and that you had to seek out, it makes it instantly available. So I remember when I was a teenager, I was fascinated by Holocaust denial. And I read about it in anti-fascist magazines, but to actually access it, that was hard. It was very hard to do, and I never really saw it for myself until mid to late 90s when I started looking around the dark corners of the web. Now, not only is that sort of stuff easier to find, it finds you whether you like it or not. It'd be very difficult to go through the world as a moderately informed individual and not know that some people deny the Holocaust or deny the September 11th attacks.
Yes, but this explanation also suggests that there's a small Holocaust denier in every one of us.
And all we have to do is read a little bit about it to get it,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the question is not the access, the fact that many more people have access to it, but the fact that so many people are enthralled by it.
Well, I found it enthralling. I still find it enthralling. There's a wildness to forms of alternative knowledge. And they're also in a...
uncritically, I mean. You were always critical.
I'm also critical, but I can see, I've never been remotely convinced with any of those theories, needless to say. But I can see the excitement in embracing them. I can see what it gives people, because it's almost an enormous sense of empowerment. This idea that the individual can rewrite the world, can change the way the world is, that everybody within them can be a researcher and can see through to the hidden structures in the way the world works. That's a very, very enticing message. And I can't remember which one of you mentioned Flat Earth, But flat Earth is an example of that. It was virtually dead. By the early 1970s, if you read histories of flat Earth theories, it was virtually dead. And the flat Earth society that existed in the 1970s was actually a joke by a bunch of college students. But now, not only is it back, it's back in a serious way by more than a tiny handful of people.
As they say, they have members all around the world.
Well, I think that's one of those apocryphal things that may be too good to be true. I doubt their website says
somebody
that.
clever like Gilad probably made it up. I want to propose a competing theory, which is also really a question. What about not just the internet and social media, but a series of, or decades and generations of disillusionment after various scientific failures, outright economic conspiracies or political conspiracies became more and more open and people could discover them because we have such, great access to information now, that led many pockets of society to become simply skeptical and say, we cannot really believe the institutional scientific findings because we've been duped so many times as citizens. And I'm thinking of many historically drastically wrong things that happened, specifically coming even from the natural sciences. I mean, from drugs that were found out to be terrible after decades of being used. And then you talk about the Lysenko affair itself. I mean, that's also an interesting case where the entire institution in Soviet society, before it was discovered, was supposed to believe, his bunk theories or his completely flawed scientific approach. Maybe it's simply the accumulated knowledge of how flawed institutional science really is that has led people to this kind of cynical approach.
Yeah, it's very difficult to combine a justifiable critical approach to science, to scholarship, without getting sucked into disbelieving everything.
How do we do that? Help us. Where do we draw the line?
I think there is a point where all of us can be skeptical about a certain kind of denialism and conspiracy theories. There is a point where they reveal themselves to be impossible. Yeah, and you don't have to be an expert to spot it. So I'm not an expert in climate change, but I do know that the idea that the vast majority, 90+% of climate scientists worldwide, agreeing on this, despite coming from wildly different societies, from different disciplines, with different political views, they all agree on this, although they disagree on much else. The idea that they could all be either engaged in a secret hoax or in a global failure of something, that wouldn't just be unlikely. It would rewrite the story of what human beings are, because people aren't able to conspire at that level. And when you compare that to real conspiracies or real cases of lying, then it tends to be tiny groups of people. It tends to be, and it often comes out. So,
except that sometimes only after millions and millions of people believe in them. Now that I'm thinking about it, even before Khrushchev's famous speech to the Party Congress where he revealed Stalin's crimes, until that point, for decades, millions and millions of people in the Soviet Union and all around the world, supporters of the Soviet Union, thought that things were fine. I mean, this was not one person's conspiracy. This was a conspiracy that an entire country managed to pull over on so many millions of people for decades before it was revealed in the 1950s. So, I mean... But
the crucial thing is that...
What if you had been a dissenter at that time?
Well, that's quite a different situation, because that's a case of a truth being propagated through violence and oppression. That is not the case in democratic societies. It's not the case that climate scientists at universities in Britain or in Israel are being threatened with jail or purging or gulags or the death penalty if they don't toe the line. So I think we have to distinguish those sorts of situations and situations in democratic societies. Not that I'm suggesting in any way that people in democratic societies cannot conspire or make mistakes or go down the wrong garden path in scholarship. But that level of mass repression, and you talk about Lysenko, it's a great argument, because the Lysenkoism was propagated in the Stalinist era in blood. It was done through killing people.
In other words, people should have realized we're dying.
We should tell our listeners that Trofim Lysenko was a pseudo-scientist endorsed by Stalin.
Except that he didn't think he was a pseudo-scientist. He was trained as a biologist, I believe.
No, he probably knew he was a pseudo-scientist.
Well, I'll leave that to the biographers.
I think you make a good claim in the book that it's not clear that he saw himself as a pseudoscientist, and that denialists in general don't believe themselves to be denialists.
No, I think no one calls himself a denialist with pride. And most people who engage... I mean, my default position is that people are sincere, unless I am given real evidence to the contrary. I think that most people do not get up in the morning and say, I am going to lie about this. I think psychological processes are much more complicated than that. And so someone like Trofim Lysenko was a serious scientist. He was just someone who was deluded and mistaken. But none of that would have been a problem were it not for the fact that he had one of the world's most murderous dictators who decided that he was right and mainstream genetics, as we have come to know it, was wrong. So that's the difference.
But somebody who wouldn't believe him at the time could have been considered a denialist, is what I'm questioning.
That's where you go down the postmodern rabbit hole and start thinking, well,
there's no truth, yeah.
There's no truth.
Well, this is what troubles me as a liberal, because I hear the accusations of those people saying, you people all believe in climate change because you have a herd mentality and you have stopped using the critical faculties that you claim to believe in to question your own findings. That's why I ask the question, because I think about this during, day-to-day life when I question my own axiom.
To be honest, I think that's healthy. And that's the difference between you and a denialist.
Aha.
Right?
Come to the heart of the matter.
If you're worrying that you could be a denialist, then you're probably not a denialist. Okay. I don't know. You told me before we started the interview to avoid sound bites, and that sounded suspiciously like a
No, but that's a good one. It's okay to do sound bites if they're complimenting me.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah. I want to ask you, another interesting aspect of it is that it's really the sort of denialist currents are both on the right and on the left. I mean, Holocaust denial and celebrating genocide and profitability is a well-known right-wing feature. I'm joking, of course. But also the anti-vaxxers are normally on the left. Is really no difference between the political orientations of denialists?
I think one of the things that we're seeing is some of the collapse of left-right distinctions here, which has always been the case to a certain extent, but I think it's a trend that's become accelerated in the last few years. Something like anti-vaxxers, I think it's very difficult to identify them with the left or the right, and you find it at both. A figure like Alex Jones, for example, sometimes he sounds like a left-wing quasi-communist radical, and sometimes he sounds like an extreme free marketeer right-winger. People like that, it's very difficult to put them into a political box. But I think, as to the general point, denialism is something that we can, all of us, whether we're liberals or extremists or the far left or the far right, can fall into. I just think that certainly certain parts of the spectrum are more likely to do it. And maybe the difference is that if you're maybe less politically extreme, you might fall into one kind of denialism, but not multi-denialism. And I think that's one of the, again, to use the example of Alex Jones, that's someone who denies pretty much every established truth. Whereas some anti-vaxxers, that's all they're interested in. And some Holocaust deniers, that's all they're interested in. Some climate change deniers, that's all they're interested in.
But I'm still trying to figure out the answer to Gilad's question, which I think you were trying maybe to not totally say. Is this mostly something on the right more than it is on the left?
Well, as someone who defines himself as being on the left, I wish I could say, yes, this is more right-wing. I'm not so sure anymore.
Okay.
I think that...
But most of the examples in your book, other than the anti-vaxxers, I think are right-wing narratives. Am I right?
You can find Holocaust denial certainly emerges out of a right or unambiguously right-wing milieu. These days, and Holocaust denial has been around in some shape or form since even the late 1940s. Today, it's much more polymorphous. Certainly, you can look at far-left anti-Semitism and you can see elements of Holocaust denial, rarely the whole package, but certainly some elements of it. So I wish I could say that this war... I think it's probably denialism marks the point where left and right break down.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Which is a disturbing space, and it's a space that is, I think, starting to expand exponentially.
More than just the, as you explained it, as this attempt to reconcile the cognitive dissonance of reality and desire. I'm trying to think whether there's perhaps a more sinister political aspect to it. And here we should differentiate between the powers that be, like the big corporations or the politicians and people who actually have power, and the masses who are following them. And I think are enthralled by all these conspiracy theories and denialisms because they are disaffected and feel marginalized. So what do you think is really the political undercurrent to it? And is it the key word here? Is it really cynicism? I mean, are we seeing, the post-truth emblem? Is it really that nothing matters anymore?
I think it's more a really weird mixture of extreme cynicism and extreme idealism, right? It's a desperate wish to believe mixed with a desperate wish not to believe. But to go back to something that you were saying, to some extent, denialism, when it serves powerful interests, in a way worries me less. Because often those powerful interests are transient, and when denialism stops being useful as a tactic, they'll stop using it. And we've seen that in the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry very rarely denies that cigarettes causes smoking. And one of the interesting things, I point to a really great quote in the book, which I can't quote from memory, unfortunately, where a prominent right-wing climate change denier in Britain called James Delingpole launched into a massive attack on the oil industry, because the oil industry, like the tobacco industry before it, is not ideologically committed to denialism for its own sake. It's doing it because it's useful in the short to medium term. And in the future, if they have any sense, they'll change to renewables because that's the best way to make money. So in some ways, the denialism that is purer, if you like, more ideological, and maybe that emerges from the grassroots, is actually the more scary kind. And yes, I think it does derive from a certain amount of disillusionment and alienation with powers that be, as we were talking about earlier. But I think its roots go back further. I think it also comes from a disillusionment with the complexity of the world. I think the world today is baffling, and without, again, blaming everything on the internet certainly doesn't help. Social media certainly doesn't help. And one of the things that denialism does, it gives people agency in that world. And that's the point where I empathize, because I know what it's like to feel. I think we all know what it's like to feel as though we cannot understand the world. We cannot have any control over it. So denialism and post-denialism give you back that control.
It's just so interesting that you have to hold yourself back from blaming the internet, but your tendency is to blame the internet. Whereas I have a much more simplistic explanation, but a different one, which is postmodernism. I mean, the great service I think postmodernism did was to explain to people that there are sometimes agenda-driven facts, right? And we can reveal them and we can deconstruct them, but taking that very far means that everybody sees an agenda in everything and therefore concludes that all facts are wrong. And then what do? Can you just reconstruct them the way you want to see them? You don't agree. I can see from your face. Well, our listeners can't see, but I can see.
I do mention postmodernism in the book, but the sort of thing you're talking about is from people who never read Lyotard or Derrida or Foucault or anything like that. I think but
the effects have trickled down, don't you think?
I think the effects have trickled down, and postmodernism was much more than a French philosopher's movement, although it was partly that as well. I think what is certainly true is that postmodernism has been weaponized and operationalized much more successfully, and this is speaking very broadly, by the populist right and by that strange left-right-wing crossover point, than it has by people committed to more, shall we say, left-liberal forms of social change. I think the great example is Putin's Russia, which is virtuosos of doing that. Extraordinary ability to pump out different kinds of narratives as though one is as good as the other, but in the service of something very traditional, which is creating an authoritarian state and backing up the power of a very small elite.
It's really quite a perversion of what the postmodernists intended, isn't it?
Looking forward, I mean, in the next book, the sequel that you'll write in 10 years' time, I'm wondering whether we are really at the lowest ebb of a curve. I mean, when the effects of global warming will become more palpable than we see today, because this is all a speculation at the end of the day, and that's really part of the power of denialism, saying that, because there haven't been millions of Bangladeshis drowning, then therefore it's not true. But
and every time there's a snowstorm in April or May, people say, you see, they're all lying.
Yeah, no, but when the Bangladeshis actually do drown, let this not ever happen. But when it becomes more urgent, do you think that we'll see some kind of sea change?
So to speak.
That's overly simplistic. But no, I don't think we will. Because we're already seeing effects from climate change. Not of the apocalyptic kind just yet, but increasingly severe weather effects, bizarre weather. And I don't see any sense at the moment of a sea change of acknowledgement. And there are all sorts of get-out clauses, because even if you do have all the predictions coming true, you can still say, well, this is natural. This is the sunspots or whatever it is. Because you have to understand what's at stake here. What's at stake here is something very precious and central to people's being that is going to be very, very difficult to relinquish, whatever happens. Now, that isn't to say that in 100, 200, 300 years' time, I don't think there's going to be acknowledgement. But 10 years' time, I'm pessimistic. But then again, my book is very pessimistic.
All right, Dr. Keith Kahn-Harris, thank you very much for coming in today to talk about your forthcoming book, Denial, The Unspeakable Truth.
Thank you very much.
You can pre-order it on Kahn-Harris.org. Is that
That's
right?
right.
That's right. So thanks very much. And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and Itai Shalem, our producer. And now we have a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app. And we would like to ask you this. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and then press write a review, and then write one. Check out our archive with more than 450 interviews to keep you entertained, busy and annoyed. If you like us here, please like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel, and follow me and Dali on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.